Hello everyone, my name is Fortifier and welcome to episode 5 of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today we're going to be talking about the fighting genre. Sorry that this episode took a little bit to come out. I know it's been probably about 2 months since we had one of these. Life was throwing a lot of curveballs at me, more so in the military, my wife changing jobs in the military, my daughter getting sick. A lot of stuff was adding up for this episode to not happen. But we overcame it, and here we are. We're about to release a fucking massive episode on the fighting genre. And I'm not doing it alone, I have two awesome people. First of all is Sarconius, who is a retro variety streamer. Yeah, retro variety streamer, but he does a lot of retro stuff. He plays a lot of hard games that I'd salt quit on, and I say salt quit, I'm copywriting that. Salty quitting, salt quit. Register trademark. Disclaimer, fucking A. Any farts. The second guest streamer is Sick Jake, who kind of came in late show. And he's another amazing streamer. He's a retro variety streamer. I do think he does mostly retro stuff, though. He does it later at night. He's got a great voice. Both of my speakers today have an amazing voice. They're awesome members of the retro community. They came together when we had a lot of personnel issues because of scheduling conflicts. This episode happened because of these two people right here. I do want to give a shout out to Gunstar Heroes because he did come out and offer to help as well, except he had, a little bit of delays in life as well. Sick Jake came in and I said, hey Gunstars, you're already on the next episode. Do you mind if somebody new steps up and takes that position? And he said, yes, go for it. It's your show. I'm still going to be happy to do Sega. So that's what the next episode is. It's Sega with Gunstar Heroes and Apesmeister, and I'm super stoked about that. By the way, while you're here, type in !free shit because at the end of this episode, we're going to be giving away a 4-pack of the 1UP Card Minis. These are good for Game Gear, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, pretty much anything that's for the handheld spectrum. And we're going to give away a 4-pack of these, but you got to be here at the end of the episode whenever the giveaway actually gets released, and you have to be here. So that's the stipulation. No watching for 10 seconds, entering, and then flapping away. Anyway, without any further ado, after 800 hours of fucking crash recovery and 72 hours of editing and a lot of root beer and sheer fucking willpower, here's episode 5 of the Ready Go Gaming Show, the fighting genre. When we think of fighting games, there are a few aspects that make or break a game, but for the most part, these core values remain the same. Traditionally, many of us remember fighting games having two people going at it on a 2D or 3D plane as time went on, but that's just barely scratching the surface of what makes a fighting game successful.
The first major aspect of a good fighting game is the character roster. Sure, you can whip out some plot, maybe make some decent endings, and have a banging soundtrack, but without a good supporting cast with variety, a game is simply that, a game. Some of the greatest franchises, Super Smash Bros., Fatal Fury, Street Fighter, and Mortal Kombat, started with a simple amount of characters and slowly built upon it, establishing franchise favorites and regulars, while keeping the magic of the games.
Piggybacking on that idea, it was important that these characters have an amazing storyline that complements the main plot, that they are visually appealing, unique, and have something called special moves. It's easy to program a punch, but when you see this, then you know you are in good hands. Can you name that game? If you didn't get it, then you need to seriously reevaluate your life choices because, man, that's easy. But how about this one? Get over here! Huh? That's Scorpion.
The final important aspect of a fighting game is the format, traditionally limited to 3 rounds, but many games, more specifically tournament fighting games, allow for the manipulation of round criteria, the most I've personally seen being 7 rounds. Talk about dedication, huh? All of these ideas in conjunction make the perfect formula for a standard fighting game, and over time, various companies could tweak these individual core tenets to better represent their own franchises and make them competitive against a market that boomed after the release of Street Fighter II. But we'll get to that in a second.
Fighting games have their earliest start in the arcades, but the tough part is putting a finger on who created the fighting game genre. The definition of the origins of the genre are subjective at best, with the definition limited in scope to how people feel a fighting game should look. Many of us remember the 2 players, face-to-face action common in the more famous franchises, but in 1976, Sega started their take on a fighting game with 2 people facing each other in a boxing ring. That is, if you had the imagination to make it seem that way. It looked like 2 black and white meatball-headed people who were slapping each other with oven mitts. But that was the beauty of antique gaming. It took imagination to complete the dots for what the developers were attempting to do. In fact, The controller for the game was really freaking weird. It didn't have buttons, it had two D-rings that you would have to push in and out to attack your opponent. In 1979, Warrior was released by Tim Skelly and looked like two wireframe peeps slashing each other with wireframe swords. It was rough, but again, that was the 70s for you. The key takeaway is that in the origins of fighting games, both Warrior and Heavyweight Champ are contenders for the first fighting game. As we move forward into the 80s, Sega released another game called Champion Boxing, which was another cumbersome attempt by Sega to beef up their fighting library. I've never played it, but it looks blocky as all get up. Data East, a well-known NES game developer, released the classic game Karate Champ in 1984 for the arcades, and was known for truly bringing attention to the one-on-one fighting format, and even featured the infamous bonus stage. Konami would release Iaru Kung Fu, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, I'd have to consult someone on the matter, but just know it's another classic gem. The two games we just mentioned would set the standard for what would inspire Street Fighter in 1987. And it was bad. God, it was bad. Ugh. But despite being a commercial travesty on the video game industry, it led to other titles incorporating their own unique ideas. Street Fighter had special moves people would have to guess or talk about at school. And Uchimata was a difficult game that featured grappling. The first game to use digitized sprites and motion capture would be Last Apostle Puppet Show. But to be honest, it was really difficult to program games that would be quick and fast, and sometimes that would get in the way of a good idea, and as such, many developers were shy in creating fighting games. Over the course of the 80s, developers played with the idea of creating games that would appeal to the public, which in the arcade spectrum, where many of these games originated, primarily focused on expanding the idea of fighting games into beat-em-ups, a subgenre of fighting games that still holds power in a contemporary setting, but home console fighting games were not nearly as popular. Well, until the 90s, that is.
As a brief recap for the previous section, many fighting games found their origins in the arcade, where they blossomed and paved their way for beat-em-ups and other subgenres that would change over time. Before the 90s, there were home console-based fighting games, but they were memorable to many of us as novelty attempts to bring the arcade home, and many times it fell short of expectations, especially Fighting Street and Street Fighter in 1987. But when Capcom messes up, they dust off their shoulders, tie their shoes, wash their faces, then do 40 lines of cocaine consecutively and storm into the office and shout loudly, "New game, let's do it!" And this is all empirically supported, by the way. It's on the internet. It has to be true. But from this coke binging, killer brainstorm session, Capcom created the gift to the planet, the start of a genre, the birth of the foundation of the tournament fighting scene, Street Fighter II. Street Fighter II was advanced in many ways and had many advantages over its competitors. Many of the elements that made Street Fighter so awesome were inadvertent, for example, the combo system. Another factor that enabled Street Fighter to be so awesome was that for the first time ever, it had the most accurate joystick and button scanning reactions present in any fighting game to date, all thanks to Yoshika Okamoto and his team. The music was fantastic, the stage is detailed, and the characters each had their own stories, unique sprites and moves that all came together to literally make the most influential fighting game of all time. Fatal Fury was designed by Takahisa Nishiyama, but their spin was more so focused on storyline, and to be honest, the home versions were as dumb as a screen door in a submarine. But when one rises from the ashes of a failed game, more are bound to recreate, like the heads of a hydra reproducing from the severed path to success, invading your wallet with its greedy tentacles. That was literally what everyone wanted to do. Sega would try with Dark Edge, which was an early attempt at 3D, but it was limited in scope of release because the developers had this release block similar to Japanese RPGs where they felt people really weren't ready for the next idea. It kind of messed them up. Art of Fighting, Eternal Champions, Holocene, all attempted to recreate the same magic that Street Fighter II brought to the genre, but ultimately, Street Fighter led the charge and still to this day. In my humble opinion, they only had one major competitor, Mortal Kombat. Midway Games, the creators of Mortal Kombat, were a humble company that only focused on arcade games such as Miss Pac-Man. Which, illegal, no, bad Midway, bad. Get back in your kennel. Oh, and they made Satan's Hollow too. And then they slowly eased into the home console market. But much like id, the people at Midway sat down and said, hey, let's kill people in our game and shit. This simple mechanic of death, especially in the capacity it is presented in, was a shock to the world. Even Congress got involved, and it led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Review Board, or the ESRB for you normies. But despite the public being shocked, gamers around the world absolutely loved the game, and the franchise, which released a few games over the 90s, was extremely successful in the arcade and home console market. These two franchises, Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, each had their own critical following. But over time, SNK started doing fantastic things, and Sega had its own success with Virtua Fighter. All in all, the 90s was a battleground for the genre, with franchises coming and going, and the ones who survived the 90s are still here today, alive and kicking.
In the late 90s, we saw a drastic expansion on existing popular franchises such as Street Fighter with the Alpha series, Virtua Fighter still kicking ass, and then SNK hitting the roids for their Fatal Fury franchise, and really any game that involved fighting on the Neo Geo. Street Fighter even got a movie, but yeah, no. Another prevalent theme of the late 90s was taking characters from different universes and crossing them over. For example, taking Marvel characters, which already had their own fighting game, and making them square off against Capcom favorites in Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes. It was a cool game, to be honest, as some of my favorite characters. It was just super... Wait, what was that? Oh, it's Nintendo! That's right, you can't have anything good in the world without having Nintendo wanting to create some version or take on some game, but they took a long time to do it. And the way that they did it was by enlisting the help of HAL Labs, more commonly known for their Kirby series. I like to think that Nintendo took a page from the King of Fighters franchise because they took all of the characters from their respective franchises that they deemed worthy and let them beat the living fuck out of each other and slammed them into a game. But the format was different and ultimately refreshing. Other noteworthy titles that brought their own unique aspect included Namco's Tekken in 1994, with its unique fighting style that varied from Street Fighter with a 3D plane. Additionally, you could control individual limbs, which was drastically different from what we expected in contemporary fighting games at the time. As well as Soul Edge, which was the first major fighting game for a 3D Spectrum that really worked with swords and capitalized on it. And finally, Tecmo's Dead or Alive, with their big, voluptuous, bouncing and luscious egos. Zack's ego. Plus he likes volleyball, but that's spin-off territory. We don't go there. The final series that I personally believe was a huge success in the arcade spectrum that deserves some love is Guilty Gear. It's a hard game, but the artwork is simply fantastic, and it deserves some love too. Once 2000 hit, the concept of new and refreshing fighters were all but done. From the ground up, future releases would simply update graphics and storyline, no more, no less. Sometimes new physics engines were created, maybe even updated mechanics such as the X meter in Street Fighter 4. But all in all, many of these games were reimaginings, and we're not complaining there. Since then, many indie games have come out, such as Mugen, and still capture the magic of these early releases. Now that we've talked about the history of the genre, let's look at some of the best voted fighting games of all time. Well, it's time to rack and stack some great fighting games. These aren't our favorites as individuals or as a group, but we like to pay attention and give credit where it is due to some of the franchises that made their game work. This is not an all-inclusive list, but hey, maybe you'll find some games that you may want to check out sometime. Let's get started.
Arcana Heart is a 2.5D fighting game popular in Japan, which was released in arcades only in Japan, but did see a release in the United States. The art style was very similar to King of Fighters, and to be honest, it's incredibly addictive. The American release was even made by Atlus, who is well known for the Persona series, as well as Trauma Center for the DS. There were 2 more sequels released and a mobile spin-off. If you ever happen to go to Japan, look for this cabinet. It's a great time.
Battle Arena Toshiden has the privilege of being the first 3D weapons-based fighting game, and in early development was called the Saturn Killer by Sony. Harsh words, huh? But this game did more than just promote 3D polygons in a 3D environment. This game practically perfected the 3D sidestep maneuver. Ironically, this game would inspire Soul Edge, the first game in the Soul Calibur series. But once games like Tekken came around and improved even more on the sidestep, Battle Arena Toshinden was pushed to the back burner. True to Sony's promise, the Saturn version was commercially unsuccessful and the PlayStation version stood strong. As I mentioned before, once Tekken took the stage, Battle Arena Toshinden started declining. The second game released in 1995 was noted for not really improving over the previous game, as the game was basically a copy and paste. And when Tamsoft, the developers of the series, replaced the game with an update, it was unfortunately a step in the wrong direction. Battle Arena Toshinden 3 was pretty much the final decent attempt at maintaining the stage with Tekken, but again it wasn't remotely strong enough to compete. And to add to that fire, Virtua Fighter 2 had just mastered sidestep as well. Then Star Gladiator came out, and that game was awesome too. Battle Arena Toshinden 3 realistically wasn't enjoyed by many people outside of Square fans. Toshinden 4 was solely released in Japan and was also poorly received, closing the door on the grandfather of the weapons fighting games.
BlazBlue or BlazBlue is a contemporary series that began in 2006 courtesy of Arc System Works. It had an artwork again like Arcana Heart, which was sort of cartoonish or anime in style of artwork, but it worked. It has a depth of gameplay and a simple roster that drives the point home. The game was buggy in-home console ports, but the arcade version is awesome, well, for the whole series, which was released in 2008, 2012, and 2015, respectively. Give it a shot if you get a chance. The entire series was present on the PS3 and 360, so if you can find them, play them.
This game is awesome. Imagine this, you're fighting someone, you're kicking their ass, feeling strong and proud that you're about to win the match, then boom! He turns into a tiger. That's right, transformations. Bloody Roar from the beginning in application was known for the ability of its roster to be able to transform into various animals. The original release was known as Beasterizer on our side of the pond, but was known as Bloody Roar throughout the rest of the world. Fort played this on Arcade Anomalies, and it's a doozy, but it's addictive and fun. The game was even developed by a company known for their great engine application, sprite work, and overall design, aiding and raising, a match made in heaven. The second game was simple, a safe move made by the companies who decided to keep the same concept, but up the roster, and it paid out. The only chief complaint people had was the music, but that's allowable, provided your game is badass, which it was. The third release was again just as successful as the series jumped from the PlayStation to the PS2. Much like all the games we are mentioning today, it was a successful arcade game with an even more fun home console adaptation. Then they jumped the shark and tried to push a fourth entry quickly, called Bloody Roar Extreme, released only for the Xbox and GameCube. The problem is, while the GameCube controller was ideal for Smash games, it was out of place for the button configuration that Bloody Roar required. So many people didn't like that. The Xbox controller was already a nightmare in application, but people did enjoy that version more. The final game in the series was released in 2003, and was average at best. This franchise was another example of something starting off strong, and unfortunately not maintaining the magic that is required over the longevity of a franchise.
This game is an anomaly. It featured one-on-one third-person battles between two opponents. It doesn't have a time limit or a life gauge. Consider it a samurai simulator, because you can literally be killed in one hit. You have different weapons, different stances, and it's got a unique spin on the genre that really hasn't been touched on since the release of this game. It has the honor of being the 25th best-selling game of 1997 in Japan. It was remarkably successful. Lightweight, the developer released a sequel a year later, and a game that was also extremely successful. It has a unique progression system that can really only be explained by playing the game. Oh, and it also has an M16 rifle in it. Seriously, a gun, and a sword fight. What was that saying? Never bring a samurai sword to a military rifle fight? Check it out though. The final release was a contemporary spin-off called Kengo in 2000, and unfortunately was a commercial disappointment, with the only gameplay being training or fighting. It had 3 spin-offs from that reimagining, and they are all exceptionally meh, so maybe dodge this one unless you're a real traditionalist.
It's not often that one dares to parody Street Fighter and does it in such a way that generates laughter and enjoyment. It's also not common for claymation to be used as a central mechanic of the game. Clay Fighter did both of these things in 1994, featuring a lovable cast of characters that Interplay brought to the stage strongly. It was a successful game that many people enjoyed for its humor, and to be honest, it's a clever approach to the genre. The second game, Clay Fighter 2 Judgment Clay, again made fun of another franchise, Terminator, and brings back some awesome characters in the same exact format. It was programmed by 3 people and was released for the SNES. A 32X release was planned, but it was canned at the last minute. However, rumored prototypes are known to be floating around somewhere if you like the 32X. Personally, I don't. The final mainstream release of this franchise was Clay Fighter 63 1/3, a joke at many Nintendo 64 games having a 64 at the end of the title. It has something new this time though, a 3-tiered super bar, from Street Fighter. But by then the idea had been played out and people really didn't enjoy it. The game was plagued by a poor speech synthesis, dreadful AI, and humor that was kind of pushed in your face more than a previous game.
With the CPS2 hardware in the arcade spectrum, Capcom had the formula to pretty much make any game instant gold and playable. But this one is kind of funky. It's unique in that aspect of where the characters are inspired by various monster lore. For example, the mummy Anacris, succubus Morgan Enslad, or the vampire Dmitry Maximov. For those who played it, it's either a positive experience or a negative one. The controls in the arcades do feel a bit stiff, and the AI is completely unforgiving. The console ports were decent at best, but people traditionally rank it as a high contender to Capcom's already popular Street Fighter series. The second game was even more abstract, as it was just a technical upgrade. The plot, mechanics, even the endings were all the same. The only difference was that Xianko and Donovan Blaine were added, and the bosses, also in Capcom style, were added as well. However, it must be said that graphically it was a major improvement, and while it didn't break any new ground in the franchise, it's a better overall game than its predecessor. The final entry would be Darkstalkers 3, and it was also a fantastic game on its own, but unfortunately other franchises at the time were much more popular.
Dead or Alive was Tecmo's take on the fighting genre, but outside of that, they were known for games such as Star Force, Fatal Frame, Rygar, and Ninja Gaiden. So this was an unexpected release, especially considering that during this point in time, Tecmo was in a bad financial situation. They were inspired by Virtua Fighter, and Tecmo wanted to take advantage of that style to bring positive financial traction. That's how Dead or Alive came to be. This is the game that was infamous for starting the trend of insane booby physics in the series. It was basically a Virtua Fighter clone, but instead of blocking, you could grab people as they attacked, grabbing their limbs and throwing them. The whole idea was to make the women sexy and to make the men badass, all while having an entertaining spin on the genre. Then came Dead or Alive 2. They designed an entire engine on making boobs bounce. In fact, people loved it so much they made a volleyball spin-off that has its own cult following too. There have been 6 main platform sequels of the game, and if you're curious about the name of the volleyball series, it's Extreme.
This is a silly one, but it's a good game. Imagine every single rapper you know that was relevant fighting in an all-out brawl. It's more interesting than the current Eminem dispute. Plus, the boss of the game is Scarface. From the Ghetto Boys. You can't make this up. If you want a funny approach to games to use relevant rap culture icons that isn't MTV's Celebrity Deathmatch, check this one out. It's also got a few sequels.
Dissidia is a franchise spin-off of Final Fantasy that I've been wanting to play for a while. It handles a lot like the Naruto fighting games, but originally it was planned as a spin-off from the Kingdom Hearts series. As time progressed, Tetsuya Naruma decided it was just better to use Final Fantasy characters. It has 3 sequels, one of which was recently released well within a year. If you like the style of gaming that incorporates familiar faces from the franchise, check this one out. Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z have been around for quite some time, and I remember many fighting games in the arcades that revolved around the characters from the show, but the fighting entry that really stood out was Dragon Ball Z Budokai. Think of it this way, it totally followed the show and allowed for you to fight actual scenarios from the anime, and that was cool. You could even fight in the World Tournament. It's important to know that this is different from the Budokai Tenkaichi series, which was a different game that still maintained fighting elements. If you like Dragon Ball Z or anything Dragon Ball, check it out.
Injustice was born from the ashes of Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. At least conceptually it was. The previous game was a nightmare, many people hated it, and the thought of a crossover between the universes again was never really considered. But the idea of a uniquely DC-related game was strongly considered and created. called Injustice. Injustice plays a lot like Mortal Kombat X. The engine works well and the storyline is great. The sequel is even better, and the series is a better reflection of the DC universe, effectively covering up the scourge that was MK vs. DC. Sega released two very powerful fighting games, Virtua Fighter and Eternal Champions. Virtua Fighter was more of a 3D-based polygon fighter, but we will cover that later. Eternal Champions was more of a 2D fighter, and was more of a copy clone of SF2 and Mortal Kombat. It was average at best, and it really tried hard to capture the magic of SF2 and MK, but it never would. It was strong in the beginning, but then it died out, with the only true plus being the artwork, which was drawn by Ernie Chan, a veteran Marvel cartoon artist. But he only got a subpar thanks. The series did create sequels, but with the rise and fall of the Sega CD, so did the franchise. It generated two spin-offs, but those two didn't do so well. If you're curious, these games are Chicago Syndicate and Experts.
The only reason this fighting game really was popular in any capacity was because the characters involved in it were characters from Final Fantasy VII. It sold well in Japan, but outside of that, it felt clunky and hard to fathom. Many consoles promised many different things, but out of the gate, the Neo Geo swore up and down that it was the go-to way to bring arcade-quality gaming into your living room. And with this price tag, you bet your sweet ass they had to make sure they were delivering. The good news? They delivered. The bad news? These games are harder than a 40-year-old clay brick left baking in the Vegas heat. SNK wanted to enter the fighting genre, and they made what they called Fatal Fury. The first game was released in 1991. It lacked incredibly when it came to competition, and home console port for many of the 16-bit era entries in the series were laughable at best. There were 7 more entries in the series, and although it maintains a great story, many people have mixed feelings about it. Either way, it's a major historical staple in the fighting genre.
Fight Night was Electronic Arts' take on the fighting genre in regards to boxing. It was first released in 2004, literally named Fight Night 2004, and it was an interesting take on the genre because the players were able to do real boxing moves in a physics engine that over time made the game work beautifully. Personally, I played Fight Night Round 2, and I absolutely loved it. I haven't played one since then, but I heard it's still doing a fantastic job, but it hasn't had a contemporary release since 2011. Guilty Gear is a good game. It's a fantastic 2D game that incorporates a unique storyline, breathtaking sprites, and phenomenal instant kill techniques that make matches incredibly interesting. The developers known as Arc System Works, the same people who brought us BlazBlue, really tied it all in when it came to this. And the music, my god, the music, it's perfect. Overall in the series, there have been 4 more sequels, and they are definitely worth taking a look at. Occasionally, there are games that make you scratch your head. Maybe, want to slam your head in a car door repeatedly. Infinity Blade is one of those. It's a phone game, but it's a fighting game. But it's like Dark Souls. But it's made $23 million. But it's compared to Prince of Persia. But I fucking hate this. Anyway, the engine, ironically, is the Unreal Engine 3. I checked it out. It's basically a fighting game that involves reflexes, so it doesn't really fit the bill for what we think of in a conventional fighting game, but whatever. This is hands down one of the most successful fighting games in the mobile spectrum.
Did you know that Rare made a fighting game? It's called Killer Instinct, and it's known for this one sound. And you are going to get used to hearing that, because this game is heavily centered around the concept of combos. And I'm not talking 10-hit combos, I'm talking easily 150 plus. The music in the game was great, the art was pretty decent, and overall it was a great experience for many of us growing up. It was followed by Killer Instinct 2 and Killer Instinct Gold, before seeing a contemporary release in 2013 to the surprise of many. The series is often considered to be one of the greatest fighting series of all time. SNK loved to make fighting games, as many if not all of their games were based around the arcade spectrum. As such, they released fighting games under the moniker of King of Fighters almost every year starting in 1994 up until 2003. where they changed the naming formula and slowed down making games. The latest entry was the King of Fighters 14, and it still to this day holds a candle to every major competitor, and likely is one of the few original SNK series to still be relevant in the style that it is. But what makes it unique? Well, like Marvel vs. Capcom, you can choose a team of individuals, but the downfall is you can't trade out. You can pick the order that you fight in, but ultimately it boils down to sheer ability and strategy to beat your enemies. If you're a die-hard fighting game connoisseur, then this game should already be on your radar, but if you aren't, definitely check this one out.
We've already covered this landmark series in depth as part of episode 1 of the Ready Go Gaming Show, so check it out if you get a chance. Another proud grandfather of fighting genre, Mortal Kombat broke out into the scene in 1992, bringing a theme that we were really unfamiliar with in the arcade spectrum in fighting games: brutal fucking murder. Well, fatalities, which is what the series is known for. The original cast of 7 would serve as the framework for the franchise, including Johnny Cage, Kano, Raiden, Liu Kang, Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and Sonya Blade. The game was unique because they physically used character projections based on a motion capture, a feat that they still use to this day. The game was massively successful in the arcades and was a strong contender against Street Fighter II. The home versions unfortunately left much to be desired, so play the Sega Genesis version if you have a choice. Midway didn't wait very long before releasing the sequel Mortal Kombat 2 a year later, and Ed Boon, the lead programmer, wanted something a little different from the previous game, even bumping the roster to 12 playable fighters. In fact, they updated a lot of the equipment that they used to improve the game dramatically, and this time it was a massive commercial success, and in 1994 grossed 2.5 million copies alone. The game set the standard for what many people expected in Mortal Kombat. It was a brilliant game, and this game alone, with its variances, account for $400 million in sales. Everybody wanted to have a piece of Mortal Kombat 2.
It would be 2 more years before another Mortal Kombat release was made, and this time, people had some mixed feelings. Here's the thing. Mortal Kombat 3 was a fantastic baseline Mortal Kombat game. It had 15 characters, unique sprite work, badass music and artwork, but they nixed some of the characters that were popular in other games. But honestly, that didn't take away from the game, and they fixed it with Mortal Kombat Ultimate later that same year, bringing back many of the characters consumers missed. The game was a massive commercial success at its release, and almost every console ever had a version of MK3 to some capacity. With the PS1 and N64 rising to prominence, it was time for Midway to make the jump to the next era of gaming, one that relied heavily on 3D backgrounds, 3D characters, 3D, well, everything. Late 90s can literally be chalked up to one phrase: 3D or bust. Well, Midway made the jump to 3D with Mortal Kombat 4 in 1997, but Ed Boon had some difficulty working with 3D programming, as it was the first 3D game Midway had developed, and to answer that issue, Midway doubled their staff to ensure that MK4 was competitive. Ironically, Boon drew inspiration from Arika's Street Fighter EX franchise, but to be honest, it didn't do as well as that series. Most people find the game to be a great part of the Mortal Kombat universe, but it kind of feels like a black sheep. It was economically successful, but it felt stiff. The Game Boy port, which was dumb considering it was on the N64 and PS1, was a brutal failure. But other than that, it was alright. If you want to play it, we suggest playing Mortal Kombat Gold, which was a launch title for the Sega Dreamcast.
Midway needed to take the time to learn how the hell to program a 3D game. And they took that time, as the franchise took a 5-year hiatus. But fear not, Renderware was here with this shiny new engine that Midway utilized to create Deadly Alliance. It was a different game, as opposed to the norm for Mortal Kombat. This time the 3D looked smooth, the motions were fluid, and you could even rock weapons and change between fighting styles. In the early 2000s, this game was literally the tits, and you could play as 24 different characters. It had a mission-based campaign mode and even unlockable content. In 2002, it was considered the best fighting game and sold 3.5 million units. Deadly Alliance was clearly a commercial success. It only made sense that another game should be released, and this time that game would be called Deception. This game was a truly unique experience that had aspects that were different than Deadly Alliance. such as to include a stage fatality system built into the arena, so if you knock someone over a certain line, as well as level transitions. It also had minigames built in, such as chess, and a sort of puzzle homage like what Street Fighter would do. The major difference was the inclusion of a plot-heavy single-player mode, where instead of mission-based campaign, there was a full-fledged adventure. Sure, the voice acting was wacky, but we follow the story of Senjuku from his youth all the way to his adulthood to find the Kamidogo. It was the fastest selling game in Midway's history and would sell 1.9 million units a year later.
2 years later, the next major entry was released to the public called Armageddon, and boy, was it. The game took the roster and injected with steroids, including every character fucking ever in the MK universe. For those of you who don't want to count, that's 62 playable characters. We weren't kidding about every person being present, even the bosses are. The game was generally looked upon favorably, and the conquest mode was even better than before, but they totally mucked up the fatality system, which was looked down upon by many consumers. But in that regard, people loved how you could make your own fighter and loved the minigames that were included, such as Motor Combat. Midway had a penchant for taking 2 years to make their games, but who could blame them? They had a formula that worked incredibly, so if their original project worked perfectly, why not add another universe? I mean, all the cool kids were doing it, right? Well, Midway did this with their 2008 release, Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, but it was too late. Midway at some point during this time was hitting financial straits, and this was their final project before selling the rights to Warner Brothers Entertainment. The game was stiff. Even I couldn't play it. It was that rough. It was just a bad game. It's unfortunate too, because even though this is a decade-late answer to Marvel vs. Capcom, it was just a poorly executed fighting game. It sold well, but this is a scourge on the franchise. When Midway Games closed its doors, it wasn't necessarily the end of a dynasty in fighting games. In fact, many of the people who once worked for Midway found their calling in working for the subsidiary of Warner Brothers by the name of NetherRealm Studios, led by none other than Ed Boon. It is unknown who decided a reboot was appropriate for Mortal Kombat, but they did it in 2011, and they did it well. Mortal Kombat for the PS3 is probably to this day one of my favorite PS3 games of all time, and sales reflect my opinion strongly. It took the original plot, remixed it, and explained a bunch of things such as how Jax got his metal arms and more. The game was dynamic, expansive, and the story mode was simply fantastic. It sold 2 million copies in the first month alone, and the rest is history. The most recent entry in the series was Mortal Kombat X, which is a continuation of the story, this time introducing new characters, some of which are kids of the original fighters. Crazy, huh? 5 million copies of this game have been sold, and still to this day it is played competitively and enjoyed by the masses. Mortal Kombat also spun off 3 games, but they aren't too fantastic. Well, Shaolin Monks is. The other 2, well, we don't talk about those. Long story short, Mortal Kombat was a significant competitor against Street Fighter and deserves a spot in the Hall of Fame for their unique spin on the fighting genre.
Mugen is a freeware 2D fighting game engine designed by Electbyte, and it's got a cult following for allowing pretty much anyone to be a playable character, provided you have the sprites and movesets. I've even seen Peter Griffin taking on Homer Simpson before. The key takeaway for this game is that you can customize pretty much anything, levels, characters, movesets, and it's a great time waster once you figure out how to set it up. This is Sony's copyright take on Nintendo's Super Smash Bros. Franchise, and it takes key members from their own franchises and pits them against each other almost completely like Super Smash Bros. Does. As a clone, it didn't really do that well, but some people swear by it. And it did win Fighting Game of the Year at 2013 DICE Summit, though.
We all know Shin Megami Tensei. Well, if you like RPGs, you know Shin Megami Tensei. And if you like Shin Megami Tensei, you know about Persona. If you haven't been living under a rock, you know Persona 3 and 4. This game integrates the characters from those 2 games in a one-on-one fighting match. It has 1 sequel, and it's awesome. Check it out if you get a chance.
This game is a battle royale, but the perspective is kinda funky. If you want to hear about this one, then check out episode 1 of the Ready Go Gaming Show, where we covered all things Capcom.
This one is an oldie, but a goodie. Imagine Mortal Kombat, but with animals. Literally animals, staged in a post-apocalyptic world of Earth. This game is hands down a cult classic for many, and if you have a Sega Genesis, this is a must-own game. It had many releases as an arcade conversion. There was a sequel called Primal Rage 2, but it was nixed before released. But then they took the framework for that game and made it into Primal Rage: The Avatar, which was a book. Well, we can't win all, can we?
SNK stands for Shin Nihon Kikaku, which translates to New Japan Project. But they should have put in the word fighting in there, because to be honest, some of the most popular SNK franchises were fighting games. Samurai Shodown is no exception. Samurai Shodown, the original game, was released on 14 different systems over the course of its lifetime, and as a weapon-based game that was floating around the time of Street Fighter II, it was massively successful. With SNK, you can always count on sequels, and boy howdy, does this series have them. In fact, there were 6 2D sequels to the series, and then 4 3D sequels, the most recent being Edge of Destiny, which was an arcade and 360 exclusive release.
Soul Calibur is Namco's take on the fighting genre, but with swords. This game is a breakthrough for the weapons-based combat mechanic and is a major contender for one of the best franchises involving weapons-based combat. The first game was Soul Edge in 1995, but to be honest, it wasn't very popular. It saw some home releases, but the true balls-deep, in-your-face, great experience came with the sequel, Soul Calibur, later in the 90s. The game was revamped, introduced new characters, had insane combo chains, and was a test of skill as opposed to button mashing. The Dreamcast version alone was a hit, selling 1 million copies, and becoming the second highest selling game on the system. For many of us who grew up with the PS2, Xbox, or GameCube, Soul Calibur 2 was our introduction to the series. Depending on which version you had, depended on what extra character you received. For example, the PS2 had Heihachi from Tekken, Xbox had Spawn, and GameCube had Link. This would become a trope in future releases as well. Soul Calibur 3 was also an amazing success, and it had a unique storyline called Chronicles of the Sword. The sequel to the sequel, Soul Calibur 4, features Star Wars characters, and Soul Calibur 5 released a few years later. There's a lot of hype generating for Soul Calibur 6 coming up soon. It's going to be badass, so fingers crossed. All in all, this franchise is a major contender in the fighting game universes, so check any of them. Well, at least the Soul Calibur's out.
Street Fighter was already covered earlier, and to be honest, it's a cult classic that is better talked about when making fun of it, kinda like the Zelda CDI games. It was a cumbersome creation, and the arcade cabinet was a nightmare. It featured 2 very large pads that you physically had to hit. Ford has a video here.
Alright, so if anybody was here for the first few episodes of Arcade Anomalies, we played Street Fighter 1 and MAME. So this one right here is the original Street Fighter console. It has the big buttons that a lot of arcade owners hated because you actually had to hit it. Now this game sucks. This game absolutely 100% sucks. But I'm going to let him play it as well so he can try it because it is bullshit. Yeah, okay. He's going to put in a coin. He's going to play as Ken because that's how it works. We get to pick 4 different places. We got Japan, that just says what land we want to go to. So we have to pick the USA. We're going to play Joe. Joe is an original Street Fighter character. Here we go.
In fact, arcade owners hated it because they would have to replace the pads quite often, but that changed with the revision that included punch and kick buttons. Ironically, it was a commercial success in the arcades, and in 1988 was considered the best arcade game. But we all know the truth. Street Fighter II, the sequel in 1991, is truly a gem of the genre which laid the framework for the genre. And at first, it was a slow game that had 8 playable characters and 4 non-playable bosses, all from around the globe with their unique moveset.
Capcom knew that they could capitalize on improving this particular game, so they released many revisions from then until now that improved the mechanics, music, and art. The first of which was Street Fighter II Champion Edition, and all that ultimately changed were improvements to audio as well as allowing for the boss characters to be playable. But the game was slow, painfully slow, which wasn't bad. But have you been to Japan? They play things fast. And they even made a ROM hack called Phoenix Edition that was an LSD trip like no other. But it did inspire Capcom to go forward and make Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting. Super Street Fighter 2 would be the next release and introduce a few new characters: T-Hawk, Cammy, DJ, and Fei Long. Oh, the memories. It was a fantastic game with new and improved audio, and the eye catch for this machine was fucking awesome. It was just a great game. At minimum, if you want the true retro experience of Street Fighter 2, play this version. You won't be disappointed. The game got another boost called Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and Akuma, or Goki, was made a playable character via specific entries on the character select screen. Can be fought against if certain criteria was met. Overall, 3 more versions were made. The game was a huge success, and it placed Capcom at the forefront of the genre, easily.
After the success of Street Fighter 2, Capcom changed in direction and headed towards making the Alpha series, which had 3 games. It was the first game in the franchise to cross over different characters from other Capcom games, namely characters from Darkstalkers, a less popular Capcom series that was prevalent in arcades. In fact, many characters from this game and another massively successful beat-em-up by Capcom called Final Fight were in this game. Critics felt it was lacking in some regards, but it was a different platform, and people will always be sketched out by that. Again, 2 more releases were made in 1996 and 1998, and all of them featured arcade releases as well as home console releases. It was made into an anthology in 2006, and you should check it out. People were begging for a new mainstream Street Fighter release. After all, Street Fighter 2 was being run into the ground. Not in a bad way, just oversaturated, and people wanted something different. Capcom answered this call with Street Fighter 3 in 1997, after the release of Street Fighter Alpha 2.
When compared to Street Fighter 2, it's a drastically different game. The art was simply fantastic, the super art gauges were cool, and they even allowed for the cancellation of super arts, something that was yanked from the concepts in a spin-off by Eureka called Street Fighter EX, but we'll get to those games in a few. The game had a fresh roster with new characters and a boss that was a grade A douche nozzle. Seriously, regeneration? Really? The game saw 2 updates, one with Second Impact and Third Strike, the best in my personal opinion being Third Strike. Now bear in mind, between all of these games there are a few spin-offs, but I'll cover those in a second. Right now we're talking about the main series. Dimps, I love that company's name by the way, worked with Capcom to create Street Fighter 4, which was well wanted after a nearly 11-year hiatus from the main series. Collectively, this game sold 3.4 million units, and hell yeah, it was fun and a refreshing take on the series. This game kind of felt like Street Fighter 2, which is what Yoshinori Ono wanted to do when he created the game. There were throws, super moves, grappling galore, super combos, ultra combos, revenge stuffs, monkey business. It was an amazing game. Chronologically, it fits in a few months post Street Fighter 2, and much like the previous game, it had its own addition to the rosters. It held universal acclaim upon release and is one of the greatest games in the franchise, but all things considered, every release seemed to be a landmark title by Capcom.
Street Fighter V was released in 2016 worldwide to the same excitement for Street Fighter 4. The roster featured 16 awesome characters, and to be honest, when it first came out, it was plagued with bugs. But worry not, Capcom gives a shit about its bugs. In fact, the revision only took 2 years to come out, and it featured some characters we hadn't heard from in quite some time. The game was revolutionary in the idea that it featured the first ever cross-platform play for the franchise. It had numerous new mechanics, V-skills, V-gauges, V-reversals. Just a bunch of awesome mechanics that made sense and worked well when they were integrated to the game. It was also the subject of massive censorship, mainly because of Art Mika and Cammy are sexy lady people, and people were V-triggered in the P-trigger, so yeah, that was a thing. Ultimately, the one thing people didn't like about the game is that it lacked a lot of single-player action and relied on the multiplayer concept. But don't let that fool you, this game is phenomenal in every way, despite the apparent shortcomings.
Street Fighter had its fair share of spin-off and non-canon games, such as Street Fighter the Movie, a really bad take on the really bad film that was Street Fighter. It started in the arcades, but found its way into our homes courtesy of the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. Despite it being a dumbass idea, it sold pretty well, especially in the arcades. Other games would include Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, Eureka's EX line, which spawned many sequels, Puzzle Fighter and Super Gem Fighter Mini Mix. Another wholly unrelated game was Street Fighter 2010, released on the NES. Overall, Street Fighter as a franchise has sold 40 million software units and over 500,000 arcade hardware units, a legendary franchise that totally embodies everything that is the fighting genre.
Super Smash Bros. Is Nintendo's take on the fighting genre, but they played it out a little bit differently. In terms of fighting games, we expected one-on-one combat akin to Street Fighter, Tekken, Marvel vs. Capcom, etc. But for this game, Nintendo took this whole battle royale, where up to 4 fighters could duke it out in a free-for-all. Of course, the story mode still had one-on-one combat, but the fun in it all involved multiple people. It's funny how critics claimed this series wouldn't last long, and boy howdy, were they wrong. The game has spawned many sequels, bringing in tons of characters from various Nintendo-released IPs, and some of which who are crossover characters from HAL Labs franchises. A new release is being planned, and it's super hyped with a massive roster, much like Mortal Kombat Armageddon, but hopefully they do it better than them.
Streets of Rage. Now this is a classic. This was Sega's major entry into the beat-em-up world, and boy did they deliver. In the game, you can choose one of 3 fighters, each with their own backstory, who advance through levels of non-stop action, creative fighting, and chiptune wet dream for fighting game enthusiasts. You can still see tons of people play this in their streams. The game has aged phenomenally, and it even supports 2 players. And guess what? Streets of Rage 4 is right around the corner. After all these years, we are anxiously waiting to see what Sega will bring to the stage.
Tekken. Oh boy. This one brings back memories, more specifically Tekken 3 and Tekken Tag Tournament from my childhood. I always saw it, but never really cared to play it, instead settling for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fighting game, or Marvel vs. Capcom instead. But where did it all begin? Well, the first Tekken entry was released in 1994, and it was really bad. For me, at least. It seemed the whole game was made in some early version of Adobe Premiere with weird, overly Japanese attempts at making a game look like badass, but falling short. I'm more so taking a jab at the art style. The game was actually pretty fun. But the intriguing part was the fighting style the game ran with. Tekken was more of a reaction-based game, again, in my opinion, that focused on combos and minimal special attacks, and instead punishing the other player for making the first move. The roster was very decent, and the ability to control individual limbs and enhance moves based on that concept was amazing. Visually, not so much, but the economic impact suggests that the idea was the birth of something phenomenal. The next entry would be released 2 years later and was met with critical success. This game was a masterpiece and was phenomenal, and the focus was literally only on the mechanics. The background kind of looked like shit, but what does it matter? You're too busy beating ass as Kazuya. I don't fucking know these things. Who wrote the script?
Fort, you think 2 looked good? Psh, 3 is where it's at. Not only was the one-on-one element there, but there were also levels that focused on a beat-em-up aspect as well, called Tekken Force. 15 new characters were introduced in addition, with 8 canon characters from the previous game. And again, it delivered fully. By this time, Namco was dead set on expanding this game in conjunction with Soul Calibur, and they pretty much had their investment in the genre secured on many fronts. The sequel would be a non-canon game known as Tekken Tag Tournament, and as the name suggests, it continued the idea of 1v1 combat, but with a tag element. That's right, 2 players per person, 35 characters. 35 characters! Plus, if you played it in the arcade, there was a pedal you had to step on to change the characters, meaning that a character change could be tactically employed, and damn, it's cool. But if you do like the traditional 1v1 idea, you can do that as well. This game was also remastered, so check it out if you like revisions of great older games.
Tekken 4 would be the first jump to the PS2 for the series and feature the return of the Tekken Force minigame popular in Tekken 3. But by 2002, people were used to the series and felt that it wasn't making new ground per se when it came to development. However, fighting game enthusiasts still gave props where it was due, as this game is a solid sequel to Tekken 3. Tekken 5 and 6 were also great releases that also paralleled portable releases, and if you're wondering, they almost look picture perfect. The most recent release was 2016, called Tekken 7, and this game is amazing. It also featured Rage Art, which is a way to enhance your moves, and also has a VR mode if you like to look at people fighting. I don't know, man, I only read the script. This game is huge in Japan either way, and if you go to any arcade there, you are bound to see row upon rows of this fantastic release. Overall, this legacy franchise has sold 44 million units of their games. There were plenty of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games to love and enjoy. But when talking about the overall fighting genre, one game, well, two, stand out. And the only reason we say two games is because there were two versions, one on the NES and one on the Super NES. Both incorporate characters from the franchise, and both are expensive games to find if you're a collector. But if you can get your hands on this one, check it out.
UFC fighting games started becoming relevant around the time the UFC as a franchise combat sports program took off. Crave as a company was charged with publishing the game, but various developers worked on them depending on what platform it was being made for. The common contender is Opus, who made the first release of Ultimate Fighting Championship for the PlayStation. Honestly, for me, this franchise was always clunky, but unlike the wrestling games that were really popular in the early 2000s, it felt nice to play as a real human based on his actual stats and actual moves. There were 8 more releases for the game, most of them made by Yuke and THQ before EA took the reins to create the most recent contemporary releases. All of them have their positives and negatives, so check them out if you want a unique, actual fighting experience with real people. The final series we're going to talk about today is Virtua Fighter, which was Sega's main franchise concerning fighting games, and right out the gate they took to the 3D realm of gaming with Virtua Fighter in 1994. It looks a lot like Tekken, but to be honest, when it came to development there were severe limitations in what people were capable of, and to be even more honest, Sega had a penchant to be inspired by other ideas on the market, and they did a good job in my opinion. It's not just for me, you know? The moon jump physics alone kind of threw me off. When 2 came out, they upgraded a little bit, and in fact it felt smooth given the roughness of the polygons, but you can tell they tried really hard. Virtua Fighter 3, in my opinion, was the first step towards a game that really looked great in the series, since they strayed away from trying to keep the 32X and the Saturn alive, and instead was focusing on the Dreamcast, and many consider it to be the greatest 3D fighting game of all time. But that's subjective. More often than not, someone was introduced in one series and they remained faithful to it for years to come. The final 2 entries are simply magnificent. Sega AM2 has done a fantastic job of keeping this game series as a sleeper series that is in the arcade, but doesn't really come up that too often in traditional conversations. Well, that was a great episode. I really enjoyed making this one. There's a lot of humor that I usually don't put in videos that I was able to kind of expand on and kind of manipulate in this episode, so I'm really happy about it. By the way, thank you so much, Sarconius and Sick J, for making this episode happen. And I'm stoked for the next one. I'm back in the swing of wanting to make videos, and I'm kind of stoked about it. Maybe it'll like light the fire for me to go do my YouTube stuff again, which I kind of put on the back burner a little bit just so I can focus on the stream. By the way, I guess it's time for me to hit that giveaway button. So let's see who won. That person did. Well guys, that's enough out of me. Thank you so much for spending this amount of time watching my project, The Ready Go Gaming Show. I greatly appreciate it. Until next time, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortifier out. Keep the flames of hope burning and the flames of retro burning even stronger. Take care, guys.